The hidden weapon. What if the greatest threat to your wealth isn't scarcity, but abundance? What if having too much of one resource could destroy an entire nation? 7.7 million people fled Venezuela. A mother walked her 3-year-old daughter across the Darien Gap, a jungle so dense that guides get lost in it. She had one bottle of water and a plastic bag with her daughter's birth certificate. That's more than the population of Massachusetts leaving everything behind because staying meant starvation. The mainstream story, a corrupt socialist regime, bled a rich country dry, but that's the surface narrative. The truth is a blueprint of 5 interlocking financial weapons. The first was discovered in the ground. The second was weaponized by a desperate central bank. The third was buried in a rigged black market. The fourth came from outside. The fifth was the final accelerant that turned collapse into catastrophe. This playbook isn't unique to Venezuela. Nigeria's oil dependence mirrors the same trap. Kazakhstan's central bank faces the same printing temptation. Iran lives under the same external pressure. Here's how the weapons interact. Oil dependence makes you vulnerable to price shocks. When prices crash, governments print money to maintain spending. Printing triggers hyperinflation. To control inflation, they impose currency controls. Currency controls breed corruption and destroy production. Then sanctions cut off the one revenue stream, keeping the system alive. Each weapon amplifies the next until the entire structure collapses. But here's what makes these weapons lethal. They don't work alone. Each one amplifies the next. By the time you understand how they interact, you'll see why Venezuela's collapse was inevitable, and why any petrostate could follow the same path. By the end, you'll understand the exact mechanism that can collapse any currency, and why the country with the world's largest oil reserves destroyed its own money. The oil trap, how dependence became a noose. Petrostates don't just rely on oil, they become oil. Every institution, every power structure, every political decision gets bent around the resource until the country can't function without it. Venezuela discovered oil in the 1920s in the Maracaibo Basin. Within years, production exploded from 1 million barrels annually to 137 million. By 1929, Venezuela was the world's second largest oil producer. That's when Dutch disease set in, named after what happened to the Netherlands when they discovered North Sea gas. Here's the mechanism. Oil money floods in. The currency strengthens. Imports become cheaper. Domestic industries, agriculture, manufacturing can't compete. Those sectors die. You become dependent on imports for everything. Then oil prices crash, and you're left with nothing. Venezuela followed this script perfectly. Oil went from 0% of exports to over 90%. Agriculture collapsed, manufacturing disappeared. The country became dependent on imports for rice, chicken, even toilet paper. In 1976, President Carlos Andrés Pérez nationalized the oil industry and created PDVSA, Petróleos de Venezuela. This wasn't inherently destructive. Norway nationalized its oil and built one of the world's most successful sovereign wealth funds. The difference was governance. Norway saved during boom times. Venezuela spent like the boom would never end. By the 1990s, Venezuela had a choice. They could have followed Norway's path, save during boom times, invest in diversification, build institutions, or they could follow a different path. When Hugo Chavez took power in 1999, oil was selling at $100 per barrel. He chose the second path. Instead of building reserves, his government ran double-digit deficits. They borrowed over $100 billion during the richest period in Venezuelan history. Chavez also gutted PDVSA's technical capacity. In 2002, 18,000 experienced oil workers went on strike. Chavez fired all of them on live television. Overnight, the company lost its institutional knowledge, the engineers, geologists, and managers who kept production running. Production peaked at 3 million barrels per day in the early 2000s, then fell to 2.3 million, even before the crisis hit. The decline was masked temporarily by joint ventures with foreign companies operating lower quality fields, but the core business was rotting from within. But production decline was just the setup. The real catastrophe came when oil prices crashed, and that's when the government made a choice that would destroy the currency itself. The spending was spectacularly wasteful. Gasoline was free, not cheap, free. This led to 100,000 barrels per day being smuggled to Colombia and Brazil. That's $10 billion per year burned on political loyalty. Electricity subsidies created the same dynamic. Power was so cheap nobody maintained the grid. Subsidies consumed over 10% of GDP in some years, more than half the fiscal deficit. Oil dependence made Venezuela vulnerable, but the oil trap alone doesn't explain the catastrophe. The next weapon made collapse inevitable: the money printing death spiral. Central bank independence exists for one reason: to prevent governments from printing money to pay their bills. When that firewall breaks, hyperinflation becomes inevitable. Venezuela destroyed that firewall completely. In 2014, oil prices crashed from $100 per barrel to $40. Venezuela's export revenue collapsed overnight. So what did the government do? They faced a choice: cut spending to match lower income, or print money to maintain it. One choice would have been painful. The other would destroy the entire economy. They chose the one that destroyed everything. The mechanism is simple but deadly. The central bank creates new currency and hands it to the government to spend. More money chasing the same goods means prices rise, so the government prints more to keep up with rising prices. Prices accelerate faster, the cycle feeds on itself. By 2016, GDP was contracting 17% per year. The following year, another 16%. Imports collapsed from $80 billion to $10 billion. Venezuelans were getting poorer at a rate rarely seen outside of war. The government's response was to print harder. The money supply expanded 20 to 30% per month. In November 2017, inflation hit 50% per month, the formal threshold for hyperinflation. By 2018, annual inflation reached 130,000%. By February 2019, it peaked at 344,000%. A cup of coffee that cost 100 bolivars in January cost 13 million bolivars by December. Savings were incinerated. Wages became worthless within days of being paid. A teacher's monthly salary became worthless in 2 weeks. A nurse couldn't afford bus fare to get to work. Savings that took 30 years to build evaporated in months. The vicious cycle looked like this: print money to maintain spending. Prices rise. Print more to keep up. Prices accelerate faster. Print even more. Prices explode. But hyperinflation wasn't the end. It was the trigger for the next weapon, a desperate attempt to control the chaos that would breed even more corruption and destroy what was left of domestic production. In 2003, Venezuela imposed capital controls and created a Byzantine foreign exchange system. There were official exchange rates where the government subsidized dollar purchases, and a black market where the real price was determined by supply and demand. The gap between rates became enormous. If you could get dollars at the official rate, you could resell them on the black market for instant profit. An entire industry of ghost companies emerged just to lobby for cheap dollars. But here's what that meant on the ground. A factory owner who had been making shoes for 30 years needed dollars to buy leather. He couldn't get them at the official rate. Those dollars went to ghost companies. He had two choices: pay black market prices, which made his shoes unaffordable, or close the factory. He closed it. His workers lost their jobs. His customers lost access to shoes made in Venezuela. The most profitable activity in Venezuela wasn't making things, it was gaming the currency system. The factory owner's story shows what capital controls did. They starved legitimate businesses of the dollars they needed. But the government wasn't done. They added two more weapons to the same system: price controls and profit caps. Together, these three weapons created a perfect storm. Price controls finished the destruction. The government capped prices on thousands of goods: rice, chicken, soap, toilet paper. The caps were often set below production costs. Producers couldn't cover expenses, so they stopped producing. In 2011, the government also capped profits and enforced the caps with inventory seizures and jail time for executives. Here's how the system worked. Capital controls made dollars scarce. Price controls made production unprofitable. Profit caps made staying in business impossible. A business owner couldn't get dollars, couldn't charge enough to cover costs, and couldn't make a profit even if they could. There was no path forward. The system was designed to fail. The result was predictable. Domestic production collapsed. The country became even more dependent on imports. But imports required dollars, and dollars were controlled by a corrupt system that funneled them to political allies while starving legitimate businesses. The system was designed to control, but it destroyed everything. An estimated $300 billion was lost to corruption through the foreign exchange system alone. That's money that could have been saved for exactly this kind of crisis. By 2019, the Venezuelan economy had contracted 61% per capita. This was already the 15th largest economic crisis in modern history and the largest outside war, revolution, or state collapse. Then 7.7 million people left. The exodus drained the country of working-age adults in technical expertise. Domestic policy created the crisis, but the government still had one lifeline: oil exports. Then the United States cut it off, and that's when the collapse became irreversible. Sanctions, the accelerant. For almost 2 decades, the United States imposed sanctions on Venezuela. Early measures targeted individuals linked to human rights abuses. But in 2019, the strategy shifted to economic warfare. Here's how it escalated. August 2017, first sectoral measures. The U.S. blocked Venezuela from U.S. financial markets and restricted PDVSA's access to financing. January 2019, the inflection point. The U.S. recognized opposition leader Juan Guaido as interim president and imposed sweeping sanctions on oil, gold, mining, and banking. 2020, the real weapon, secondary sanctions. Any country or company doing business with PDVSA would face U.S. sanctions themselves. Venezuela was cut off from formal global oil markets overnight. The impact was immediate and brutal. Oil production had already fallen from 3 million barrels per day at its peak to 1.6 million by January 2019, before primary sanctions. After secondary sanctions, it crashed to 337,000 barrels per day by June 2020. That's a 79% collapse in 18 months. Secondary sanctions forced Venezuela to sell oil on black markets at steep discounts to partners willing to launder sanctioned crude. Every barrel sold this way earned less revenue and enriched middlemen instead of the state. Each wave of sanctions was designed to cut off a different revenue stream. First, financial access, then sectoral access. Finally, market access. By 2020, Venezuela had no way to sell oil, no way to finance imports, and no way to generate revenue. For Venezuelans, this was the moment they realized there was no recovery path. The government couldn't print its way out. The currency couldn't stabilize. The economy couldn't rebuild. The one sector that could have saved the country was now generating less revenue than ever. Hope died in 2020. This is where the story gets uncomfortable. Sanctions didn't create the hyperinflation or the money printing. Those were self-inflicted. But sanctions eliminated any possibility of recovery through the one sector that could have saved the economy. The counterfactual matters here. Without sanctions, Venezuela's oil sector might have stabilized at 1 to 1.5 million barrels per day. Production has since recovered to 850,000 barrels per day, but that's still 70% below peak capacity. In October 2023, the Biden administration temporarily lifted some sanctions in exchange for commitments to free elections and prisoner releases. But when those conditions weren't met, sanctions were reimposed in April 2024. By December 2025, the pressure escalated further. The U.S. Coast Guard seized Venezuelan oil tankers. A blockade was ordered on sanctioned vessels. Assets were frozen globally. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Sanctions didn't create the crisis, but they guaranteed there would be no recovery. The playbook revealed. Let me map the 5 weapons for you. The first weapon was discovered in the ground. Oil dependence. It made Venezuela vulnerable to price shocks. The second was weaponized by a desperate central bank. Money printing. It triggered hyperinflation. The third was buried in a rigged black market. Currency controls. They bred corruption and destroyed production. The fourth came from outside. Sanctions. They cut off the one revenue stream that could have saved the economy. The fifth was the final accelerant. The interaction of all 4. Each weapon amplified the next until the entire structure collapsed. Currency collapse requires both internal rot and external pressure. Venezuela had oil dependence, money printing to finance deficits. rigged exchange rate systems that bred corruption, and then sanctions that cut off the one remaining revenue stream. This mechanism is replicable. Any petrostate with weak institutions and geopolitical enemies faces this exact risk. Subscribe for more breakdowns of hidden financial mechanisms that shape our world.